Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. It's very, very exciting to be here. It's very exciting to feel this energy of the conscious techies. And I'm personally really, really excited about this panel because Salma said at the opening, right? The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. And here we have people coming and representing different tech hubs, rising tech hubs across the world, from Vietnam to the entire Africa, basically, with Think Africa, to Egypt with Rasha. So I'd like to first start by asking you guys what led you, especially, for example, you don't come from Vietnam, so what led you to explore that country in particular and to stay there for that long?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my name is Andrew Rowan. I am based in Vietnam, although I'm from New York, and I'm very happy to be here with all of you today. Thank you very much to the organizers and all of you for joining the session. I come from a tech background, so I used to do smart homes, so kind of Internet of Things before it was IoT. And I was working in New York, and we had a project in Saigon, or Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. And so my first time was in 2011. And I was just struck by the energy, the excitement, the electricity that I could feel in Vietnam. And I had the opportunity to go back in 2013. I was only supposed to be there for a short amount of time, and it turned out to be about a year. So here we are in 2018. I've lived in Hanoi for about 2 years, in Saigon for a year, and I spent 4 out of 6 months in Da Nang, so in the north, the central, and the southern parts of the country. As mentioned, I wrote a book, Startup Vietnam, Innovation and Entrepreneurship in the Socialist Republic. And I'm currently a consultant at the Finland-Vietnam Innovation Partnership Program, although I have to state that my views are my own and I'm not representing the organization here on stage. But it's a fascinating place, and it's not a place that I think folks think of when they hear innovation, especially coming from the US. The US has a very different orientation, I think, to Vietnam in general, especially in the 20th century. And it was interesting for me personally to see the differences between what we learned in high school and then actually experiencing what it was like there on the ground, working with entrepreneurs, innovators, and public sector partners as well.
Hello, everyone. My name is Elisabet Miheludaki. I'm half Finnish and half Greek. I currently live in Finland. I've always been kind of in between the two cultures, and I think that has led me to where I am today. I believe that everyone should be able to work to solve problems that they really care about, even though they might not be from the country that the problem is in. This idea about global citizenship, that we are all in here together and we should collaborate on these very serious problems together and find ways to solve them together. I'm an entrepreneur in Finland. I'm also on the board of Think Africa, and with Think Africa we empower the diaspora in Finland, the African diaspora, to integrate in Finland, but also connect with stakeholders in their countries or other African countries, and find whether there could be some interactions there so that everyone can start working for the advancement of African countries in that way. I've also organized conferences and events to link the different startup scenes in different European countries, Germany, Finland, but then African countries as well. Mostly I've had experiences in Kenya, in Angola, in Benin, a bit in Ghana. And happy to be here today as well, and thanks for the organizers for making this possible.
What led you to entrepreneurship then, Rasha?
She decided to ask me another question because I'm from Egypt, so it goes without saying I should be staying in Egypt. No, actually, this is not my background. It's not. I'm a civil engineer. I worked in construction for a very long time, and then I decided that I hated it, and I wanted to work in innovation and specifically open innovation. So I'm very pro to openness and people working together, communities working together, and transferring knowledge and transferring tech. But if you ask me why I do what I do, why I'm in Egypt doing what I do, and I feel because of everything that's been said since the morning, since the opening, and specifically in the last fire chat, it is very fulfilling to help others. It is very fulfilling to support startups and entrepreneurs, to see them grow and to see them create jobs. I think just creating jobs for me is seeing each job being created, and I know that behind every job is a family that's being supported, is very fulfilling. So maybe if I go back to the presentation today morning that really affected me, maybe I'm in the awakening phase, so I'm finding this volunteer work, support, and giving back to my country very fulfilling.
Right, right. I guess that's something that also binds us together. We ended up working in entrepreneurship despite coming from different areas because we kind of discovered entrepreneurship is the future. This is where the hope is. This is where youth are, taking it upon themselves to create change. And we're here to discuss what are the next big hubs, the next big tech hubs.
Can I ask you something?
Of course.
Okay. You're from Argentina.
Yeah.
Okay. Typical Egyptian now. Okay. Why have you stayed in Egypt and helped others? Answer the question. Yeah.
That's a very romantic question because I fell in love with Egypt, and I fell in love with Egypt's entrepreneurs and Arab entrepreneurs, despite again not coming from a world of finance or economics or entrepreneurship itself, but coming here as a journalist to discover what is the Middle East and what is the Arab world and what is Islam and how I came here feeling the duty to understand this region better. And instead of the conflict I was told I would find, I found this incredible young people who were not, they were in Tahrir demanding change, but they were also creating change by themselves. And that was incredibly, incredibly inspiring. And especially because, just as Andrew said, in Vietnam, right, it's the barriers and the obstacles here and in emerging economies are huge and are obstacles that people in the West cannot even imagine, right? So being able to raise and start something from scratch with all the obstacles that implies, both in terms of gender, both in terms of, generational gaps with older generations, in terms of, sometimes institutional barriers. So being able to raise beyond that is incredibly inspiring. So there was a big story to tell, and in turn you end up being a part of it. I guess. So what has it been like for you, Andrew?
Can you be more specific?
Yeah. So the journey, arriving to Vietnam, interacting with the startup community, and being part of building that process. In building Startup Vietnam and writing the book, what is it that you found there?
Yeah, so besides writing and consulting, I'm also an entrepreneur. The founder and director of GKTA Group, which is a link between the public and private sectors in Vietnam. So we've partnered with the Finland-Vietnam Innovation Partnership Program, the U.S. Embassy in Hanoi, and also the Ministry of Science and Technology of Vietnam around innovation initiatives. I've had experience in a few areas in Vietnam, so not just smart homes, but I tried to do a startup in 2013 in Saigon with a cross-cultural founding team. We took a novel advertising platform and tried to localize it to Vietnam. It didn't work out, but it was a great sort of crash course in consumer market behavior in Vietnam. Besides working with the public sector, also developed content creation. So I started writing about Vietnam in 2014 to sort of share the interesting and the exciting developments happening in the private sector in Vietnam. And then for the book, I crowdfunded the book prior to wrapping it up. So the book's coming out shortly. And I think what was really sort of interesting is when I moved from Saigon to Hanoi, it was almost like having to relearn everything again, because the differences between Saigon and Hanoi are pretty vast. The mindsets, the approaches, the ways that people interact with each other. So prior to that experience, for me, like Saigon was Vietnam and Vietnam was Saigon. But then once I went up to the north in Hanoi, which is the capital, it really, I would say, evened out my experience a bit. And then with that thought process in mind, it's sometimes easy to forget that about 70% of the 96 million people in Vietnam live outside of urban areas, right? So the experiences that you have in urban areas aren't generally representative of the livelihoods that people have across the country. But it's been fascinating, I would say, the experience, because everybody has a story to tell, for sure. As you mentioned, the concept of stories. I'm not sure how people look at their own stories and how they promote and package and share their own stories. This is always kind of a challenge to really figure out and get a better sense of, what is actually going on, because there's a lot of information asymmetry in Vietnam. It's very hard to get accurate data. Sometimes you have conflicting data. Sometimes you speak to 10 people and you have 100 different opinions about what's going on. And also because of the environment, the political context, people sometimes aren't comfortable sharing what they really think and what they really feel. So it's very challenging in some ways to really dive deeply and to see if this is a one-time instance in terms of a product or feature, or if it's representative of a greater trend, or if it's part of a regional movement, in a sense. So I think combined, it's been really an advantage to live outside of a society that I grew up in. And you get to see what a society incentivizes, encourages, asks from its citizens. And I think you also look back at your own society and you discover what you truly value as well as a person. So maybe you have a similar experience to that, Elisabet, or?
Yeah, the same question about, yeah. Well, I haven't been that involved in one specific country, but from my experience in the different places, it's very encouraging what is happening, and of course some places are more advanced than others, but from my perspective I see the value that we can have more in places where there's not a lot going on yet. So we know the big hubs in Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa. Those are places where things are already happening. So what we want to do is go to places where things are just getting started, where there's a lot more untapped opportunity. Of course, with opportunity, there's always its own challenges, but that's just something that you have to learn to manage, especially in a context like in a lot of African countries you will find. So it's something really encouraging that I see happening in many countries with startup scenes that are just now starting, but there's a lot needed still, and there's a lot of effort that needs to be put, especially to the investors, to convince them that why should they go there, why does it make sense for them to go there, and of course that they will make some profit out of it as well as impact, because those two things should go together, otherwise it doesn't work. Yeah, did you have any particular question about the countries or the startups?
Yeah, so basically, speaking of, developing these hubs, Gina was saying something very interesting earlier. We're kind of, our imagination is dominated by Western iconography, Western ideas, and sort of a structure. Same goes with entrepreneurship. We have this one model that we want to replicate, right? But thinking of developing other startup ecosystems, I'm thinking with a bigger lens of, the next big hub. What does it take really to develop a startup ecosystem?
Yeah, they really need to find their uniqueness what makes them unique, not try to replicate something that is already happening. Of course, it's good to see what others are doing and take bits and pieces and combine that into something that works. But on the other hand, you need to find what can you do differently and what can you be the best at and go with that, because you can't do everything. And then what I've seen is that okay, the money is a big problem, but it's not the only problem, and sometimes it's not even the most important problem. So in terms of mentoring and advice and networks, those are really important things that sometimes are lacking as well. And what we believe in is that these startup ecosystems that are now growing should tap into networks in other countries that are in connection to the diaspora there and could help in many respects, because people in the diaspora in Finland as well understand the specific problems in the countries in Africa, so they can really provide the experience that they have had in Finland, for example, and combine that with what they know about their own countries and give a fresh kind of perspective to what the startups in those countries are trying to achieve.
Right. Rasha, as a key player in the Egyptian startup ecosystem, what do you think it takes to develop the startup ecosystem?
Okay, so first of all, you get it out of your head that you don't have to replicate Silicon Valley. Okay, Silicon Valley is unique. Okay, so we don't need another Silicon Valley. You can create your own, and then you have to find out who are the players, who are the stakeholders, and what I have learned through the last, I've been working with entrepreneurs for the last 7 years. There are a lot of players, there are a lot of stakeholders, and they're all very important. So there's a role for academia, there's the role of the market, the role of investors, the role of research, the role of the freelancers, the entrepreneurs, the talent. Everybody has a role, and you have to identify them, and then you have to really connect them. The higher the connections, the faster the growth of the ecosystem, the higher the impact, and through these connections, knowledge is transferred, and not just there's this knowledge which is the explicit knowledge, as they say, it's documented, you can read it, but the most important knowledge is the knowledge that cannot be documented, the one that we call tacit, the one in our brains, the one that we acquire through our day-to-day business as usual work. This being very absorptive of this knowledge through connections and networking, I found that this is very, very, very important, paramount. So I think this is what has helped the Egyptian ecosystem to grow. It came at a time when, with the revolution and with the change, with all this disruption, and sometimes out of this ad hoc, there still happens some kind of ad hoc structure, let's call it. And I think this is what happened, and it brought the different ecosystem players together, and they worked and they developed the ecosystem. We still need more, definitely. Of course, there's still a lot more to do, but I think we have achieved quite a bit.
Right. So part of the reason we're here is to highlight different startup ecosystem, because the challenges they're facing are more relative to our humanity, more relative to real problems the 80% of the world's population is facing. So back to Andrew, what do you think are the main challenges entrepreneurs face in Southeast Asia?
Well, I want to focus a bit more specifically in the Vietnamese context, because Southeast Asia, of course, you have 10 diverse markets, and they're all at different stages, the economies of development, of growth. Even within the immediate region, so Indochina, you have wide ranges of economies between Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. In the Vietnamese context, specifically, I think some of the major challenges are access to resources, in terms of if people have talent, like what to use that talent, like what to develop, what problems to identify and solve. I think part of that can be addressed simply by traveling. Sometimes you have developers who haven't traveled 100 kilometers outside their hometown, right? It's very difficult from that orientation to develop a product for international markets if you have not been to even some of the major cities in your country. And I think travel in some ways is one of the great ways to also see like what are your own country's strengths and your people's strengths when you're in a different society, so you can see like what's potentially missing in this new place where you're spending time that you have coming from your home country, and vice versa. You know, what's missing, or what, if you're going to an innovation hub, for example, you can see there how things are done, develop a network, and then loop parts of that network back into your home country. This is along the lines of the challenge with brain drain, right? So you have people, the best people, usually study abroad, they spend time on the outside, but in Vietnam, people are starting to come back, not just people who've studied abroad, but also elements of the diaspora who understand both Vietnamese culture and Western culture, or US culture, or French culture, or wherever the case is. And these folks are natural trusted advisors or ambassadors or bridge builders to help close that gap. And part of the reason why I wrote the book is because it's the book I wish I had when I first went to Vietnam. And I hope that it'll hopefully reduce cross-cultural miscommunication by helping to set expectations for incoming foreign investors and entrepreneurs who are interested in living or working in Vietnam. Because, as was said rightfully, it's very different from structured environment that you're coming from in a place like the West. And I think the real opportunity in places like Vietnam, places like Egypt, is you have an advantage to create industries, to create institutions that have already been fully developed in parts of the West, right? And that's, I think, a real responsibility and a real opportunity to help shape portions of future development of a country. So you know, that's definitely a real challenge. And it might sound simple, but English language comprehension is a challenge. It's different between the North and the South. So people in the South of Vietnam, they speak much better English than they do in the North. And so if they're trying to go global or regional, they're pitching in English to investors in Singapore or incoming delegations of investors from Silicon Valley. It's very difficult to communicate what your value proposition is if you have a hard time communicating in English, which is still the language of doing business, right? Whether you want to focus inward or not. So it sounds simple, but that's a major obstacle for some entrepreneurs in Vietnam.
Right, right. It's similar to what's happening here in Egypt as well, right? Where you risk creating this bubble where, you know, it seems like we're all English speakers and it goes perfectly well, but it's not the reality. There are many, many people that are incredible, very talented entrepreneurs, yet they don't manage, you know, English language as well. And this is why, you know, it's very, very important to have organizations like, well, TIEC works a lot in Arabic, right, Rasha?
Well, we have to work in Arabic because we want to reach the bottom of the pyramid. We want everybody in Egypt to speak the language of entrepreneurship and innovation. So all our content is translated in Arabic, but it's available in both Arabic and English. We also have a decentralization strategy, so not to get out of Cairo and to go to very far away. So we go as far as Asyut, Sohag, Minya. If you're an Egyptian, you know where these areas are, and try to talk the same language. We're also trying as much as possible, although you know that's not the right approach, but to talk in the colloquial or Arabic Egyptian accent Arabic, which is not, you know, absolutely right. You know, we should talk in Fusha in Arabic, but we find that was very difficult to use Arabic Fusha and break that barrier. So we had started using the colloquial Arabic. So yes, we do use a lot of Arabic to get to to reach the people. Maybe it's not such a bad thing. After all, we are 100 million Egyptian Arabs, so we do speak Arabic, so Arabic is an important language. And also, as Egyptians, we are 1/3 of the Arab world, so I don't think it's a big barrier. There are more other barriers that I will tell you about right now. Go. Okay, so right before I came here, we were working on the barriers and the challenges with a very important player in the ecosystem called Rise Up, and they're doing the Startup Manifesto, and we have found 8 challenges, and then we kind of went down to 3, and we prioritized them. And after just half a day at the summit, I have actually decided that these 3 challenges are access to finance, access to talent, and access to market. And honestly, after half a day in the summit, I decided it's access to consciousness. Okay, so we need to be more conscious. So I'm going to change them. They're going to be access to conscious finance, access to conscious markets, and access to conscious talent. And I'll tell you why. So you would have a VR technology, and you would have a startup that uses VR to do a game, and they would find an investor. But you have, and this case exists, and you have this amazing entrepreneur who's developing VR technology for autism, and they cannot find finance. So we need conscious finance, okay? If you come out with that game in the market, you will find those who acquire it. You come out with the VR for autism, you will not find the market. So we need conscious markets. Do we access to conscious talent? Yes, there is talent in Egypt, but they will not go and work for a startup, because they would rather go and work for a corporate. And if they do work for a startup, it would be for a year, they develop their talent. It's more like, they get the exposure, and then they would go to a corporate. So if we can develop conscious talents that would understand the value of working for a conscious tech startup, then we would find conscious tech investors and a conscious tech market. And I think these are the main challenges. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. You taught me about conscious tech. Thank you.
Right, I think this is something really important as well, thinking about the market, right? We sometimes forget that. We think, no, it has to be in English. We have to focus on, like the markets abroad. But what about, we are talking about emerging economies that have populations of, Vietnam has, you said, 96 million, right? Egypt, 100 million people. We at Startups Without Borders, for example, are working with refugee entrepreneurs who need to think also of other refugees as their market. So we need to start thinking of markets within the regions as well, and within these communities as well, right? I think it's also really interesting that you both work with diaspora communities, right? Which has a lot to do with migration and the movement of people, which then goes back to the country of origin, right? So Elisabet, do you want to tell us a little bit more about how that works? How do you gather the diaspora? How do you contact them? And how do you get them involved?
So we organize various events, like during Slush last year, we had an event to connect the startups from developing countries that were coming for Slush with the diaspora in Finland and other stakeholders with whom they could possibly partner, and investors as well. So we tried to kind of be the facilitator of connections, bring everyone together and let them figure out what they could do together, because in that kind of setting, meeting someone who is doing like something similar that you are doing, for example, as a startup, I can share an example of a startup that would be working in health tech area, and then there's lots of students in Finland as well studying that, so they could really bring new kind of perspective and different knowledge to that startup as well, and to really help them accelerate their journey. So networks is what I think is something that can really help these startups, and one of the challenges that they have is access to those networks and to information about different things that could be useful in accelerating their journeys. So that is something that we are trying to do with our networks and with the various events that we organize.
Okay. Andrew, how about the Vietnamese diaspora?
Yeah, so there's 4 million members of the Vietnamese diaspora worldwide. They're in places like France, Canada, Europe, Central Europe, UK, Australia, of course the US. So half of the 4 million are in the US, and half of the ones in the US are in California. So there are 1 million Vietnamese Americans in California, about 100,000 specifically in San Jose, which is an hour south of San Francisco. So they have access to basically the heart of Silicon Valley. Many of them have worked for tech firms. Some of them are interested in coming to Vietnam to work, either as mentors or as investors. And it's interesting because their experiences with Vietnam are through family or through history, right? I don't have any family or historical connections to Vietnam. So it's, in some ways, their experiences are coming from generations, their parents or aunts or grandparents. I don't have that same orientation to Vietnam per se. I'm affiliated with the University of California, Davis, and so one of the ways that we're trying to foster the diaspora reconnecting or creating stronger connections with Vietnam is by partnering with the University of Da Nang. And so there's an event coming in August, which is preparing Vietnam for the next phase of growth, from possibilities to a vision and action. And that really is focusing not just specifically on the GDP growth rate, but how it works, or what will be the increases percentage-wise in order to promote inclusivity, sustainability, and really benefits so that folks in Vietnam can all participate in the growing digital economy. And so that's a unique event, and folks are coming into Vietnam. It's open to anyone who really cares about the future of the country. And that's different from a lot of the economic trade promotion events that you might know of or hear about from chambers of commerce or things like that. And I think it's important to specifically and actively choose on what you want to make investments in, whether it's in education or innovation in general, because if you don't know where you want to go, then it doesn't really matter how you get there. And I think that's tied to identity and branding. And I think we were talking about this before. When you hear the word Vietnam, you don't necessarily think of innovation. Or if you hear the word Mexico, you might think of sombreros and violence. And it's a very difficult starting point for countries to try and attract foreign investors or foreign entrepreneurs, or to create a vision for young people to build a better future. When you have this kind of legacy of the past, that's in some ways, I think, preventing imagination and innovation from taking hold in some cases.
Right, that's so important, right? So something I've been really, really passionate about is sort of highlighting the stories of the next role models of the Middle East, right? Because this is it both serves the purpose of changing the perception of the ecosystem itself, of the country, of the country's youth and the region's youth, basically. But it also serves the purpose of offering young people a role model they can identify with, a role model that doesn't look like Mark Zuckerberg. Can you think, and this is, I mean, whoever wants to take the microphone first, are there these role models, are they being developed, are they being highlighted in each respective ecosystem?
They're there, they're growing. I mean, the ecosystem itself is still very young. So if we started this ecosystem maybe in 2010 in Egypt, it's only around 7 or 8 years old. And so you do have startups. We do have now some cases like we have the Swivel. If I talk about the region, not even just Egypt, Swivel and Kareem and all of those. But I don't think they're being highlighted enough. So I don't think we how can we say that, celebrate success as much as we should. You're getting me an area and I don't want to get into. So the media is not is focusing on these other things, and they could be focusing on these beautiful cases of entrepreneurs and how hard they're trying. There are amazing women out there, and they're doing so many good things, and nobody highlights what they're doing, how much they're growing, how much they're inspiring other women. So I think we need more media and more spotlight on these entrepreneurs, and then we will just have our next Mark Zuckerberg and our next Elon Musk.
Elisabet, do you find these kind of role models within diaspora communities, for example, so successful cases that are living abroad?
I kind of want to also talk a bit about whether we should have these billionaires as our role models. If it's all about conscious tech and really making an impact, should we be aspiring to be billionaires or just have a little under that and evenly distribute it to everyone? Because if we are going to create that 1 or 2 billionaires, many people are going to still stay in poverty. So I don't think we should even aspire to that kind of role models anymore if we are really being conscious.
That's a very good point. That's a really good point. Yeah. Perhaps we should we should think of these role models as change makers rather than billionaires. I mean, why do we need to focus on the profit itself? It's about what you're doing and the legacy you're giving or you're leaving, right? Andrew, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so has anyone heard of Flappy Bird here? Okay, great. So Flappy Bird was a hit in 2014. It was created by a Vietnamese independent game developer named Nguyen Ha Dong, who's based in Hanoi. And I think this was the sort of proof that for Vietnamese developers that you could earn a living making games, right? So he was at the height of the popularity of Flappy Bird. Reportedly, the game was making 50,000 US per day. And, like anywhere you slice it, that's a lot of money to make in one day, anywhere in the world, right? This was real tangible proof for the developer community to see, we can develop games and also make a living out of that. So I think that's a great sort of success story in and of itself. The thing is, I think from a sociological perspective, no one wants to be first or last. And if you're first, it requires courage. But then once people see that it's viable, then you have this flow of interests, of capital. And we saw this with co-working spaces, right, in Vietnam. In 2013, there were 2 co-working spaces. And at the time, folks thought, like, why would I pay for membership when I can just buy a coffee in a cafe and hang out all day, right? But then in 2015, we had co-working space chains across the country, and people saw the value of a co-working space more aligned with community, right? Finding folks who are going through similar challenges as you are, connecting with complementary partners, and having a space for people to congregate and have events and all that kind of stuff. So that mindset, that perception changed over a period of time, right? It doesn't happen overnight. And also I'd say the concept of role models, it hasn't manifested itself in giving back to the community, which I would say is a core tenet of Silicon Valley. This theme of contributing for up and coming talent, for the next generation, and this the sort of access to folks via warm introductions or email introductions or whatever the case is, that spirit, I think, has yet to arrive in Vietnam. But I think that'll change. And of course, within the natural cycle of entrepreneurship, folks who have exited, they switch to the other side of the table. They become investors, and they plant the seeds for the next generation of entrepreneurs. I think once that happens more consistently and it becomes more commonplace, you'll start to see inflection point reached.
Wow, that's a very interesting point, and it's quite surprising. We were earlier talking about, the superpower Egyptians have, which is basically helping a lot without expecting anything in return, right? So yeah, it's a very surprising point, and I think it's part of what makes the startup community or the startup ecosystem so interesting. Is that it has a character or a nature which is very collaborative, right? Rasha, have you been working in that sense at TIEC?
Sorry, in what sense?
Collaborations, triggering collaborations, and the giving back in terms of the Egyptian ecosystem being very, very solid.
Yeah. I think it's probably the only place in Egypt or the only ecosystem where everybody works with each other. They don't want anything back. Nobody keeps data from each other in the entrepreneurship ecosystem. And you always ask somebody for anything and they would do it for you. The entrepreneurs also have the spirit of paying it forward. So if they work, when an entrepreneur grows and the startup grows and you come back and you ask them and you tell them, would you help this entrepreneur, mentor them, they would do it. And I think this is a great spirit. There are no silos in the entrepreneurship ecosystem. It's very well connected and very giving back.
Right. I think it's also a characteristic in the country and in the region, perhaps, right? I always say this, so there's this image that stayed in my mind forever, that to me is the metaphor of the country. So imagine the situation, you're on a bus, the bus breaks down, what do? What do people normally do when the bus breaks down?
They all park and try to help the bus.
Exactly.
And block the road.
So in any other country, you'd get off the bus and wait for the next one, right? No, in Egypt, the passengers get off the bus and push it all together. And to me, that was the most beautiful metaphor I've ever seen of how here we're in this together and we're all going to push the bus, right?
But not just those on the bus. Even though others in private cars, they park the cars and they push the bus. And then you have people, the vendors on the side, they leave their vendors and push the bus. So everybody's pushing the bus.
That's very, very interesting. Have you encountered this kind of collaborative spirit within African startups?
Of course. I don't think it's, maybe it's more pronounced here, but I don't think it's specifically to any country. I think it's a thing of the startup scenes in general. Everyone wants to help as much as they can the others. I think it's a thing of the startup scenes in every country.
Right. Yes.
I want to make three points actually. One is individually, Vietnamese are very helpful, and I've personally experienced that. There are three distinct ecosystems, at least in Vietnam, right? So you have Hanoi, which is the political and cultural capital. You have Da Nang, which is in the center, and it's oceanside town. You have mountains, river, and ocean, all within 20 minutes. Right, that's something that's unique to that city. And then Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City is the economic center of the country. So they all have different strengths, they all have different challenges. The communities are different. And when I talk about the ecosystem in Vietnam, it's really three different ecosystems. And you can tell, you can feel the difference when you go to one, to the other, to the third one, right? And so that's, I think, important to keep in mind, that the context of those three different cities. On the national context, though, I'm not sure that everyone is, public sector, private sector, developers, entrepreneurs, all the support. I'm not sure we're all on the same page, especially because when we talk about startups, people conflate it with any new enterprise, right? And of course, we don't want to discourage entrepreneurship, but the needs of a cafe are very different from the needs of a software company. And so when folks talk about startups, they talk about new enterprises. When the term mentor is used, it's unclear if they're talking about a consultant or a mentor, as we understand it, kind of a guide on the side to help draw out the questions that need to be asked and the conclusion, and usually pro bono, right? That's not the same sort of understanding there. And so, you know, when we describe startups, it's usually any enterprise that has high growth potential rapidly and is sustainable. And that's still one of the major challenges at events, you know, when people talk about startups, and I think that helps, or that contributes to this kind of misunderstanding or speaking past each other. I wonder if it's the case here, if there are dedicated words for entrepreneur in Egyptian Arabic or investor, because that's also something that is challenging in Vietnamese language, right? People will speak Vietnamese, and then you'll hear angel investor, right? So they'll take words from English and just drop them in, or just, you know, switch between the two, because there aren't necessarily dedicated words. Like innovation, literally in Vietnamese, is creative renovation. And that also has origins from a political term. And then the word for businessman and entrepreneur is interchangeable. Doan Nguyen, and then the first being Doi Moi Sang Tao. So it's very contextual how you use it. And again, the needs of an entrepreneur are different from the needs of a businessman. The journeys are different. And I think these are sort of the nuances that matter. Details matter, and language ultimately matters as well.
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to open up the space for questions from the audience, if anyone has. Yeah. Is there any mic? Okay. Right. Should I rephrase the question? Should I repeat? Yeah? So the question was, how are we, Egypt, I guess for Russia, and the other regions as well, so how is Egypt collaborating with the other countries in the MENA region to foster a strong hub like Silicon Valley is, without replicating it, but like focusing on that strength based on collaboration?
Okay, so first of all, I don't really think the uniqueness of Silicon Valley comes just because there is an availability of a huge market. Of course, that is a catalyzer, but it's not the reason. And because of that, they try to replicate Silicon Valley in the States itself and make New York another hub. And that was not, it is a thriving hub, but not Silicon Valley. Then they tried to do the same with Berlin. Okay, so Berlin is amazingly thriving right now. But again, it is not Silicon Valley. So what we're saying that Silicon Valley is very unique and it's a case of its own. We can work on our own different types of ecosystems. So that's the first part of the question. On the second part of the question, which is a very smart question, thank you. How are we connecting to each other? I think I was surprised to know that Vietnam is 96 million, so and we're 100 million. So I find that one of the key success factors to the growth of the Egyptian ecosystem was the fact that we have 100 million in the market. We are a huge market, so it's a great test bed. So you start off with locally developing something, testing it in your own market, and then if you need to globalize, then you do globalize. But the second place that all the Egyptian startups go to, the second market would be Saudi Arabia. So it's close in culture, there's access, and it's the second biggest market. As the government, we might be availing opportunities to, first of all, we have a platform which is called Egypt Innovate. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's called Manasat al-Ibda. It's in Arabic and English, and it is very well connected with Saudi Arabia. The registered users, we were at 25% of the registered users are from Saudi Arabia. So that's one way. Another way is the summits that we try to invite and send the startups to. So we're very in close relationship with the MISC Forum. If you're familiar also with the MISC Forum, it's huge. And we send a delegation of entrepreneurs there all the time. We host Saudi investors for to connect them to Egyptian startups so that they can open the gate to partnerships and to markets in Saudi Arabia. So this is one case of Saudi Arabia, and the other case is the Levant in general, so another, like the Emirates. But again, for the Egyptians, the second biggest market is Saudi Arabia. So if they're only interested in going to the Saudi Arabia, and usually after Saudi Arabia, it is globalization. So they would target the European market or the US. And again, the way we do that is through trade fairs and summits, through connecting with, we do what we call a soft landing program. So we're in connection with other business and incubator entities and business centers in Europe specifically. So Europe is a lot more in proximity and closer in culture to the Egyptians than the US, and we send them to soft land there, and this is how they have access to the European markets. So I hope that has answered your question. I think what we need to do is actually try to work closer with similar hubs in Africa and similar hubs in Asia. I think that's what needs working on more.
Yeah, I have seen a lot of interactions, like different programs or accelerators in the region, welcoming startups from the rest of the countries in the continent, but still there needs to be a big effort on combining forces kind of and collaborating in a more meaningful way. But I think that requires that first the specific countries figure out who they are and figure out their own startup scene first, and then see how they can collaborate really well with neighboring countries or countries in the continent in general. So there's still a lot to be done, but everything has been put to motion. So I think we're going to see a lot more in this respect in the coming years.
Yeah, so I would agree with Rasha that there needs to be, or there should be, more common interest to forge connections between innovation hubs outside of going through Silicon Valley. And in the Vietnamese context, Vietnam has received a lot of investor interest from Singapore. There are many Japanese and Korean companies that are interested in coming into Vietnam. I just read this morning that KOTRA, which is the Korean Trade and Promotion Agency, they're moving their Southeast Asia headquarters from Singapore to Vietnam as a result of all the expected interest from Korean companies looking to go into Vietnam. At the same time, Vietnamese entrepreneurs are starting, or they have been the last few years, going abroad, participating in events like Slush. I was part of a Vietnamese delegation to Slush a few years ago. They've gone to also the Global Entrepreneurship Summit, which I believe last year was held at Stanford University. They've gone to Startup Nations And so all these are opportunities for Vietnamese entrepreneurs and Vietnamese founders to go and see what it's like in other ecosystems, other communities, and to help people also understand Vietnam a bit better, right? Now they have another data point of actually interacting with a Vietnamese person instead of relying on either stereotypes or misperceptions or outdated conceptions. And so that's why, you know, I advocate for folks to go outside, to travel, to meet with people who they haven't met before, because they might be pleasantly surprised, and they could even meet an ad hoc partner along the way. So I think there are definitely opportunities for partnerships and collaborations that will be materialized as more Vietnamese go abroad, whether it's to study, to work, or as tourists, and as more folks go into Vietnam as business people, as students, and also as tourists. So that I think that two-sided flow is important. It can't be lopsided, because then you don't get the full benefits of that cross-cultural exchange.
Right. Well, we're being asked to wrap up, so I'd like to thank you so much for being on the panel, and thanks everyone for joining us.